Welcome to the sixth episode of The Right Side of Maybe, the podcast where we talk to forecasters about their forecasts, their thinking behind the forecasts, and how we can all learn from their process moving forward. Today we're joined by Juan Cambeiro. Juan is a recent graduate from Macaulay at Hunter College, where he majored in biology with honors. He's done bench work in an RNA lab and also has experience in epidemiology and biostatistics. He's a super forecaster and placed first in the Good Judgment Project's 2.0 focus tournament on COVID-19. And he is also first or second in the three challenges on Good Judgment Open that he's working on. He's most active on Metaculus and recently started working as a biosciences analyst, where he has also done part-time work as a moderator for the pandemic domain for the past year. We're going to learn a lot more about Juan and his background and some of the forecasts he's worked on. But to start, we're just going to get some background information about Juan. But before we even get to that, I just want to welcome Juan to the podcast. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So to get started, we were wondering how and when you first were introduced to quantified forecasting. If you were sold on it immediately or if it took some time to sort of get acclimated to the practice, and what interested you about forecasting in general.
Yeah, so I first heard about it a few years back, but I didn't really get interested or think much about participating in quantified forecasting until the fall of 2019, when I listened to Rob Wiblin interviewing Phil Tetlock on the 80,000 Hours podcast. And yeah, they had mentioned Good Judgment Open. So I was curious and joined and started forecasting on a couple questions. And then in early 2021, I learned about Metaculus from Rob Wiblin sharing Metaculus questions about COVID on Twitter, and got really excited about Metaculus. So that's how I got introduced to it.
And when you first sort of got introduced to quantified forecasting and you actually started doing it, did you initially just do it as sort of like a hobby, like I'll spend like 10 minutes forecasting here or there, and then slowly over time as you started forecasting, you got much more serious about it and started working at your skills? Or like once you started forecasting, was this something that you wanted to get good at? And sort of what were those first steps that you took while forecasting to get your accuracy and calibration better and more, well aligned?
I think the path you just outlined is exactly the case for me, in that I started out pretty slow. I just started forecasting just because it seemed interesting and fun, not so much because I thought it was like a very important thing to get better at, just something that seemed cool to do. But yeah, I didn't spend all that much time on the questions I forecasted on. I just picked out a few questions that seemed interesting. I'd spend a couple hours on them a week, usually no more than like 5 or 6 hours a week. But then it was COVID that really got me into, like even at one point obsessing about forecasting, especially in the spring and summer of 2020. So I spent a lot of time on forecasting, like instead of 5 hours a week, maybe 4 hours a day, if you count like all the reading. But I don't think I could have gotten to a place where I could do accurate forecasting on COVID if I hadn't had at least that introduction to forecasting and playing around with it in the fall of 2019.
So you just talked about some of the reading that you were doing. What sort of information was part of your sort of research when you were going through some of the early questions? You mentioned this COVID forecast. Was there a process that you had to find like relevant signals for your forecasts? Common questions that you had that you would look for answers to? And did you spend a lot of time following the news in general?
So for COVID forecasting in particular, something that I found to be very useful, probably more useful than like reading any other news source or even all of the news sources combined, is to assemble like a list of about, in my case, about 80 people on Twitter who provide really good analyses and insight into important subtopics on COVID. This like both gets helps me get a handle on important information much sooner than most news sources get to it, and to get it closer from the source. So I found that to be super valuable.
And how did you sort of like find those users on Twitter? That's something that, we've done for some of our forecasts. For instance, on like the Donbass region, we created a Twitter list of people that seem to, do open source intelligence for the region. And many times for us, it's like we'll stumble upon like one good retweet and then we'll find an account and then, find other accounts that those people have found. Do you sort of similarly just stumble upon these accounts, or have you sort of honed a sort of practice in terms of trying to find these few sort of signal identifiers and good analysts on Twitter when there's, throughout the sea of noise that exists?
Yeah, so that's one way of doing it, that I have employed, like looking at the likes and retweets of analysts that I already trust. Another way is just like you curate your feed to just almost entirely be about COVID. You'll just see, you'll just get content that aligns with your interest. And then I dig into like past tweets that these individuals that I've come across have made, kind of get a sense as to how accurate they've been in the past, what their track record might be, even if it's not a quantified track record. Just like, for instance, were they write about masks sooner than most other experts? That's usually the way I'd go about doing it.
And just like, as you were taking in this very nuanced and analytical, yeah, information on COVID, did you find that had a different way in which you viewed the situation? Did you felt that you had a much more nuanced view of the pandemic? Did you feel like you were much more like well informed and like knew where the pandemic was generally heading before others, and that gave you a different sense of mind? And basically, like, did you notice like a beneficial side effects from this information diet that was critical to your forecasts?
Yeah, like in addition to these people usually being the best source of information, they were usually like well ahead of the curve, and like sharing the most important and relevant information, and sometimes even like parsing through the implications of that. Um, so like that, and it doesn't even have to be people who, or oftentimes isn't people who have any background knowledge on the topic. So um, for instance, the first person who comes to mind, which I had mentioned earlier, as the person who introduced me to Metaculus, is Rob Wiblin, sharing COVID forecasts in January and February of 2020. I mean, just the fact that he was sharing all of these COVID forecasts really alarmed me, in the sense that it was a signal to me that this was an important issue. And then I myself like arrived at the conclusion like in mid-February that we were going to get hit hard by COVID in the US. It was all but inevitable.
Just a quick question. I want to go back a bit. So we talked about your experience in biology and also biostats. For these COVID forecasts and just for forecasting in general, do you feel like your background helped to prepare you or give you sort of like a leg up over some other people that might be entering the space? Like, did your background in biostats that all provide you with some, information that, you found relevant to your forecasting?
Less than you would think, especially since I didn't work on um, like viruses in particular, right? But I think the one area of COVID forecasting that it might have helped with in particular is around the variants and like the mutation rate of the virus, and the fact that very few people, I mean, even I didn't really foresee the extent to which SARS-CoV-2 would evolve to both evade immunity, but especially to become more transmissible and even deadlier. But in terms of understanding the mechanics of how that's possible, like the biology undergirding it and the space of evolution that's left, I think that's like the one area I might have a better handle on as a result of my background.
I'm just also, before we talk more specific about your approach to forecasting, since you forecasted, have you sort of noticed like just other benefits that, doing this process has sort of helped you? Like, has it increased your ability to pick up and learn new information faster? Has it moderated your political views a little bit and helped you have more nuance? Because there's research coming out of Penn with Barbara Mellers that has found that the process of forecasting helps moderate our views. And as I'm sure you're aware, every single time you forecast a question, most of the time it's a lesson in learning a lot very quickly and being able to process that information, place it into the future. So have you, noticed other benefits towards your analytical and reasoning skills as you forecasted more?
So in terms of like actually adjusting my views or my beliefs as a result, I actually don't think forecasting has really influenced that very much. I think what it has influenced is how I search for new information and how I pick out what I think is most relevant, because that's exactly what you have to do when you're forecasting, especially on a question you don't know much about. So you're doing like some background reading and trying to figure out what the important factors at play are. So I think that's a skill that I picked up along the way as a result of forecasting that I can apply to situations in which I'm not forecasting.
Wonderful. And then also just really quickly, I'm curious, did you happen to, you mentioned that, one of the first steps that you did for this forecast was to go on Twitter and find other people who had smart analysis. Did you end up teaming with anybody on these forecasts, or have you explored working with other forecasters in the community, especially now that you're a super forecaster? Has that come up to you at all?
I do now to an extent, but I didn't at the time just because I think I was relatively new to forecasting. I didn't really, I mean, retrospectively now I can see like the value of teaming up with others, but at the time I didn't really see the need to do it. So I didn't, but I should have, and I am at the moment, and I expect to continue to.
Got it.
So now I think it'd be great if we move specifically in terms of your approach to forecasting. And you provided us with three great forecasts that we want to walk through. But before we get to those specific forecasts, we want to just talk about your larger approach to forecasting. So you placed first in the Focus 2.0 COVID Forecasting Challenge and have scored really well on Good Judgment Open COVID-19 forecasting. What do you attribute primarily to your success in COVID forecasting specifically? Has it been your ability to find good information from Twitter? Has it been your ability to, determine signal versus noise? Have you what would you say has been your key ingredient in terms of being so good at COVID forecasting?
I certainly don't think there's like a key ingredient. It's more of a process, right? Like the way one approaches forecasting and actually does it. Um, so for questions for which I already know a lot about the topic, so for instance, when approaching a new COVID question where I already know a lot about the particular situation, I can spend as little as like a few minutes on it for my first forecast on it, even if I don't like consult the background information or base rates or whatever it is, just because I'm already so involved in forecasting similar questions. But for in terms of my general approach to approaching a question, so first, if there's background information provided, I read that as well as any links that were provided. If after that I can't come up with a good base rate, and I feel like I still might not have a good enough grasp on the topic, which I usually don't at that point, to at least take a first pass at the question, then I use like some combination of scanning an introductory article, usually like the relevant Wikipedia page, honestly, as well as like reading some recent news articles on the topic and the comment section for that question. After that, at that point, I almost always have what I need to arrive at least a somewhat correct base rate and understanding to make a first forecast. And then this might be particular to me, but then I don't like immediately input that forecast. I just kind of arrive at it in my head. Then I consult the community median and I adjust my forecast before inputting it if it's like way off compared to the median. This like adjustment method though really only works well for binary questions, less so for date range and numeric ones where I can't really avoid seeing the community's distribution. But yeah,
So
that's
you
my
normally
usual approach.
hide the community median until you've reached your initial base rate assumption, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And
like,
yeah,
how long
then
do you think that that takes for you to get to your initial point? Obviously, it'll differ forecast to forecast. Some questions are obviously much easier than others, especially if they're similar to a question you've done before. But if it's like a relatively new question where we're having to do background research to get to that initial forecast, do you have a sense on roughly how long that normally takes you?
Really depends on how much I know about the topic, but maybe on average 45 minutes to an hour. But that can vary a lot from like half an hour to 2 or 3 hours.
And then it seemed like when you were sharing your forecasts, you rely on a lot of small and frequent updates. Is that true across the board, or more so for other questions? It wouldn't surprise us, given your skill, that you update all your questions frequently and in small batches. That's what Pavel Atanasov's research found, that the best forecasters, that's what they do. Generally, is that something that you tend to do on most of your questions, is sort of small updates over time?
It is, yeah. Both as a way of getting me to seek out new information that might be relevant to that forecast, especially like new news updates, but also as a way, especially if it's a question I've started forecasting on recently, as a way to just take a fresh look at the question, which I think is probably useful in reducing my bias and helping me catch things I've missed.
Awesome. So now, Clay, unless you have other questions, I was thinking we could get into the first of the 3 forecasts that we want to discuss today. And I thought we could start with the question, all 3 of them are on Good Judgment Open, about mortgages. And so I'll just read the question out loud so that the listeners know what we're referring to. The question, which started on March 13th of 2020 and closed in June of 2020, read, before the 27th of June 2020, will the weekly average contract interest rate for 30-year fixed rate mortgages with conforming low balances in the US fall below 3%? So, I mean, before we get into some of the questions, I was wondering, if you could maybe explain what that question is asking for the readers, or what that is, for people who may not be familiar with fixed rate mortgages.
Okay, see, this is a good question to discuss because it's an example of how I forecast on questions where I don't really have both like the relevant background knowledge and also I have difficulty in understanding what it means. And at the time, I don't really understand what 30-year fixed rate mortgage with conforming loan balances really meant. Essentially, it's something like a mortgage on a single family home that meets the requirements of Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, with the requirement that the loan amount is under like $500,000 in most areas of the country except some urban areas, and that interest rate is fixed over time. It's something like that, but anyway, that I like really have to know what it is. Not really. And I think the fact that I didn't really know what it is and I didn't really have the relevant economics training to properly evaluate the question actually helped me in the end, because just looking at the base rate, which is all I pretty much did, and looking at the changes week over week are how I arrived at my forecasts.
So on this question, yeah, the initial sort of community forecast, once it stabilized after the first week, was about 75% chance yes. that the weekly interest rates would fall below 3%. For context, what was your initial forecast on this question?
Yeah, so my initial forecast for the question, just pulling it up, was 15%.
And then it reached a low of, I believe at some point you had 0% as well in that forecast, correct?
Yeah, toward the end, I reached 0, but even somewhere in the middle forecasting on this, I reached a low of like 2%.
So clearly, I mean, you got right off the bat, you were on the right side of maybe. Many times in these questions, it's people getting there much quicker than the community. And as if you're watching this video on YouTube, you can see it took about 2 months for the community average to go below 50% and consistently stay there. So you got there about 60 days beforehand. What do you think you got initially correct in this forecast? And then conversely, what do you think the community on good judgment, missed off the bat and took them 2 months to realize?
So I'll start off with the caveat that I think consulting the community median to make sure you're not way off it, especially for questions where you don't have a very clear and confident explanation in your head as to why you're probably right and the community is wrong. I think that's something that you have to look at very closely. And it'd probably be worth sharing your analysis in a comment to get feedback on it from other forecasters. Like if you got a bunch of upvotes and no one is challenging you, then you probably have more reason to think you're right. But if you get people challenging your reasoning, then that's a way for you to course correct. But those aren't really things I did in this case, which is usually not my approach. Here, I just very heavily relied on the base rate. And the base rate was just overwhelmingly clear to me, and that the interest rate stayed within a narrow range of 0.55% between about 3.4% and 3.95%. We also started out much closer to 4% than to 3%. And even in this especially volatile time, the interest rate never increased or decreased more than 10 basis points week over week. So it would take at least a couple of weeks of sustained decline for it to fall below 3%. And we were just never really close to that in the time frame of this question.
So I see sort of an analogous situation here between the way that you did this forecast and the way that some analysts look at stock markets, where they have technical analysis and fundamental. The technical being sort of just looking at the movement of the stock and thinking about the future of it based on prior movements, and the other one being having a more macro perspective on the market and deciding your financial thoughts that way. It seems like you were leaning more on the technical side of things, where you had a base rate and you're looking at the weekly movements to determine your forecast. Did you think at all about sort of the macroeconomic picture of the United States and how that might affect this forecast, or was it really more just that weekly movement that you were paying attention to?
I did to an extent, yeah. And there were some really good comments in the comment section that were considering that inside view, which was basically something like this huge negative demand shock would drastically lower interest rates, probably in this case to below 3%. But then something else you have to consider if you start considering the inside view, and that a lot of people seem to have missed, was that seems like that huge negative demand shock and its effects on interest rates seems to have been largely canceled out by the huge purchases of mortgage-backed securities by the Fed, right? So if you were considering the inside view, you would have to take both of those into account to reach the conclusion, which ended up being true, that the interest rate would stay roughly stable and within roughly the historical range. But if you had just not considered the inside view and just considered the base rate, you also could have gotten there in that case, which just speaks to how valuable looking at the base rate is.
And would you say that just in general, this is sort of a broad forecasting question? Do you think, at least for you, it's harder to do these updates or to find the base rates? For instance, for this mortgage question, I'm sure US mortgage data goes back a long ways, and there's a lot of different reference classes you could use to think about this question. Did you find, updating it harder, or did you find finding that initial base rate more difficult?
In terms of time commitment, finding the base rate and the right base rate is definitely the more time intensive task. Um, then the weekly updates are usually pretty easy in that you just look at how the interest rate has changed in this case week on week. Um, and it's just a good way of making sure your forecasts don't get stale, right?
Mhm.
It's really not that time intensive or that difficult to update them if there is no if there are no huge changes going on in the situation. And
So
in
when
this case, for me, there weren't, in that I wasn't really looking at the inside view all that much. But for others who were like almost exclusively considering the inside view, there was a lot going on.
when it came to those like updates and looking at how the mortgage rates were changing week over week, were you looking at absolute change, so how close it was getting to 3, or the rate at which it was changing down? I'm guessing you looked at sort of both, but did you have a sense in terms of what you were weighing more at the time mentally?
I was definitely looking at both. I think a third factor was like trying to determine when it would hit a low.
Mm.
And that was probably the main thing I was looking out for. And in fact, I had misjudged when I thought it had reached a low, but it in fact had not. It had just gone back up for a week or two and then got back down to a new low, but it never really approached a low of 3% or below 3%. But yeah, I was basically looking for the, the record low that it would reach.
And now, sort of, I want to focus on now the other. So you've shared with us 3 questions, and so this is another one that you got onto the right side of maybe right off the bat in before the rest of the community. So this question was asked on April 13th, which was saying how many, April 13th, 2020, how many states will have reported 1,000 or more COVID deaths out of the 1st of May 2020? And the correct answer ended up being more than 13 states. But if you guys are watching the YouTube video, initially more than 13 had around a 0 to 5% likelihood, and only became the dominant forecast a day before the question closed. It was a massive sort of uptick. And yet your initial forecast was that the more than 13 would have about a 85% likelihood. Could you explain to us your approach to this question, how you achieved your initial forecast, and what you think you got right on this one?
And I'd say, especially given the fact that, as Clay said, this started on April 13th, that was like really close to the start of the pandemic. How did you sort of curate your information? I'm sure there's a lot of information out there at that time.
Yeah, so the broad contours of like my thinking at the time, really since mid-February, was that the response would be inept in the US and we wouldn't really put the proper interventions in time to prevent it from COVID from killing a lot of people in the US. So like my thinking in this question, for instance, started out with based on the current trajectories of cases, which are being undercounted by some significant factor, will almost certainly reach more than 13 states, reaching over 1,000 deaths based on both current death, but especially case trajectories. So that's how I started out.
And so, do you think that it was making that initial assumption of, how this is going to unfold, that the community sort of missed, that they were taking it more so as the current data with face value and not anticipating the undercounting and that there wasn't going to be a marshaling of a large federal and coordinated response right away, that you sort of spot out well before everyone else? Or is that just, one of many factors that you felt you got right?
I think that's probably the main factor. But also, there was just at the time a huge difference between the COVID situations in different states, right? So, for instance, at the time, New York and some direct surrounding states were especially hard hit, but didn't necessarily seem like there would be enough states outside of the Northeast that would be hit hard enough in time to reach over 1,000 deaths in this time frame. So it was really a matter of assessing the extent to which COVID would spread throughout the different regions of the US.
Now, and also just re-looking at this graph, I'm gonna guess the situation, given your forecast in the community, is that at some point it became, is it gonna be 12 states or is it gonna be 13 states? And that was sort of the big disagreement because you were saying over or 13 or more states for a while, and then closer to resolution, you sort of switched that it would be between 11 and 13, which to me indicates that there was like a state on the border, and then just before resolution, it realized that that wasn't going to tip over. And so, do you think that was correct? Because to me, it looks like at first, looking at this community graph, that they kind of just got it wrong forever. But another interpretation is that if there was a state on the border, that the initial interpretation of the community was wrong, but then throughout the majority of the question, they just were sort of straddling the state on the border. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you have another interpretation of what was going on here?
I think that's right. Yeah, and that if I recall correctly, this question ended up resolving as more than 13 because it
Mhm.
reached 14. And it reached 14 because Ohio, up until the end, was like a toss up. So essentially, my initial assessment was that, yeah, well, like based on the current trajectories of the different states, which I had like all on a big spreadsheet, we'll probably end up reaching 13, maybe 14, 15, 16, or sorry, 14, 15, 16. And that assessment really did change as the trajectory of deaths in Ohio in particular didn't end up seeming like it was on track to hit over 1,000. But it ended up hitting that threshold because of updates to its backlog. So they were filling in deaths that had occurred in previous days, and that's how they ended up reaching over 1,000. But there was a point toward the end where I readjusted back toward the community median, both because it didn't seem like Ohio was on track to exceed 1,000 deaths, and also because I really heavily started analyzing, depending my forecast on these analyses and forecasts by this team at Los Alamos, which put out a COVID model for all the states of the US. And at this time, I was looking through the histories of these models, and Los Alamos had the most accurate forecast, the most accurate model for forecasting seasonal flu in the 2018 to 2019 flu season. So I adjusted heavily toward what their forecasts were saying, which is that we'll probably fall somewhere in the 11 to 13 range. So those two combined caused me to adjust back toward the community median. And then at the very end of the time frame of this question, Ohio did fill in those backlogs, and it seemed like they were going to exceed 1,000 deaths, and they did.
You mentioned COVID modeling right there. I'm curious, given your experience forecasting COVID, and looking at these models, what what value do you think that these models give? There's been a lot of reports in the media about what all these models show. Very rarely are there updates saying, how these models have actually fared. And there's been research, coming out of people that we've had on the show, Regina Joseph, Pavel Atanasov, showing that machine learning models and stuff generally underperform human forecasters, and you're an extremely successful human COVID forecaster. What sort of role, when understanding the pandemic, do you think machine models have, and what role do you think human forecasters like yourself and community forecasting platforms like Good Judgment Open and Metaculus have in terms of understanding the trajectory of the pandemic. You have Virginia Health Department. They've opened up a series of questions on Metaculus trying to understand through human forecasting how the pandemic is going to shift. So clearly, there's a sense within the public health community that human forecasters have a seat at the table. Um, how do you sort of view these two components when it comes to understanding the pandemic? And given the history of the pandemic and pandemic forecasting, do you have a sense for which one is better overall?
So at the beginning of a pandemic, I think that's where human judgmental forecasting is most useful, in that there are too many uncertainties to plug in for computational modeling to be all that helpful, although it can still be broadly helpful in um, like laying out the space of what's possible. And then human judgmental forecasting can try to quantify all of these uncertainties and arrive at, like, try to be a little more granular than the computational forecasts. Um, then the computational forecasts become more valuable once they get a handle on the extent to which cases are being undercounted, what the delay between a case being detected and the death occurring is, what that time lag is. And then some models, so I'm thinking of Yu Yang, whose model in particular here, ended up doing extremely well. And that's where computational forecasting can really come into play, I think, once a pandemic really gets going. And in that case, human judgmental forecasting becomes more valuable on the margin for questions that computational modeling would, again, have a hard time with. So for instance, trying to get a grapple on the future evolutionary space in terms of mutation rates and variants, which at some point in the future, computational modeling will probably be able to do, but at the moment cannot do all that well.
But even like where computation modeling does well, given that, like, does it still not make sense for human forecasters to sit on top of those outputs still as a process? Like models are still, right, it's humans in some ways automating their forecasting process. So it would seem like if you have good, well calibrated, unbiased and unnoisy forecasters, that having them sit on top of model outputs almost as just making sure that the outputs make sense in terms of a larger understanding, that there still is a place for humans even once we're in a world where the analytical and automated models can still put out good outputs. Would you agree, or do you see it differently?
I do agree, conditional on the resources being made available for like having the manpower to do that, right? But that's, for instance, what they do in weather modeling, right? Yeah, I think ultimately that's going to be the best approach for infectious disease forecasting, I think. But it would necessitate the manpower to look over all those forecasts and adjust them appropriately. But for just like a couple of like forecasters doing it as a hobby, it's too much to look at forecast for like all 50 states, for instance, that are updated daily.
I want to look at this forecast quickly from a personal perspective. Earlier, Clay mentioned that forecasting, on account of Barb Miller's research, has the ability to moderate views, political or otherwise. Do you feel like working on this forecast so early in COVID helped you to sort of compartmentalize your own anxiety about the disease as you sort of did the forecast, just like the act of sort of objectively looking at the signals and understanding the severity of it versus, potentially just listening to what the news was saying?
So I'm actually not sure. Like, if anything, forecasting on COVID made me more alarmed early on about COVID and more anxious about the prospect of COVID hitting humanity hard in the very near future. But what it did help with was guiding like my personal decision making. So I, like, in February, I stopped attending like large lecture classes. I tried avoiding mass transit as much as possible. The one mistake I made was not to embrace the use of masks at that point. I didn't until sometime in early March, but and yeah, in terms of guiding my own personal decision making, it helped.
And I'm
Very
guessing
interesting.
also like once, when during like the initial, oh, the lockdowns will just be like a very short thing. It may only be 2 weeks. I'm guessing that you had a different sort of sense of how that was going to unfold and were a little bit less naive as the sort of lockdown measures came into place as well, which I'm sure had, in some ways, it's bad, you're saying being more anxious about the pandemic, but in some ways it makes you less long-term anxious because you have a clear understanding of where things are probably going to be headed as well. Um,
Yeah, I
so
mean,
yeah.
I think, for instance, to that point, when most of Europe and North America was under stay-at-home orders in mid to late March, it was already clear at that point that COVID would become endemic, right? That was never going to go away.
Mhm.
That we're not going to stop it with contact tracing. Um, I think the key uncertainty at that point was simply like, would we have vaccines in time to inoculate as many people as possible to protect them against it before it reached them?
So we've talked now about two great forecasts where you got to the right side of maybe before everyone else. And now we want to shift to your third and final forecast, which we're really glad that you shared because this is a forecast where you're on, as we now like to say, the wrong side of maybe. And I thought it'd be great if you could sort of walk us through, what you got wrong. So for context for our listeners, this was a forecast that was asked in June 2020, which closed May 1st of this year, 2021, which was asking, before May 1st, 2021, will it be officially announced that the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and or Paralympics will be canceled? The correct answer was no, and that's what the community got. But you viewed this question differently. Could you walk us through how you initially approached this question and, the fact that you ended up getting this question wrong and why you felt that given your strengths in COVID forecasting, why this question was an outlier.
So there were two key failings on my part here, both on the extent to which COVID would spread in Japan part, and also on the political response and political reality and how that would guide decision making by Japan's government and the IOC. So on the COVID front, I really did not understand at the time and still really don't understand how Japan has been able to avoid the worst of COVID, and that they never implemented stay-at-home orders. They have a really elderly population. Um, they had a lot of contact with China at the beginning of the pandemic, um, and yet, and even with new variants arising, they still haven't been hit all that hard compared to most of the rest of the developed world. Um, so that was a key failing of mine that I really thought that, especially once B117 emerged and its transmissibility was characterized, now the variant is called Alpha. I thought for sure it would hit Japan hard since they did not have the mechanisms in place to be able to implement stay-at-home orders. And then in turn, I thought that being hit really, really hard by COVID at that point would mean that, in terms of the Olympics being politically feasible, that would they wouldn't be at all politically feasible at that point. And then on that end, yeah, in terms of political feasibility, opinion polling, like poll after poll, would show that the Olympics, going ahead with the Olympics, was very unpopular among the Japanese public. At one point, reaching like 80% of the Japanese public not wanting the games to go ahead. And I just thought that that would obligate the Japanese government, not literally, but in terms of wanting to maintain their popularity, especially given that there was a new prime minister in place, who I expected would want to solidify his standing by being popular. But that didn't end up being the case, in that I think the political motivation in mind was that it would be bad for Japan's image to the world to cancel the games. And that's what
Yeah.
ended up seeming like the decisive factor, more so than like opinion polling.
So it sounds like, you were considering the domestic political constraints and the public health constraints, but you're saying that
Right.
you missed out the geopolitical, reputation constraint. I'm also interested, what you didn't mention in, how you approached this question was examining the economic constraints of canceling the Olympics. And I was wondering if that's something that you considered for listeners who are unaware. And I think, this is something that I wasn't aware until I read the media reports, but that it's up to the Olympic Committee to cancel the Olympics if the host country, if Japan in this case, were to cancel the Olympics unilaterally, that they would be on the hook for, I think, tens of billions of dollars that they would owe the IOC. And so not only, was that the reputational aspect, but there's also an economic consideration here at play. Was that something that you considered in your forecast, or do you think that's one signal, and I would argue an important signal, that you missed in your forecast?
So I had considered it to a degree, but I underestimated how important it ended up being. Both in that I didn't. So I knew, for instance, that it was the IOC that ultimately had to make the decision to cancel the games or to postpone them for a second time. And I kind of figured there would be some financial ramifications for the Japanese government. I didn't really know what those were until later on. And as you said, it's actually in the billions of dollars. So that's an additional factor that I failed to consider early on. Yeah.
Were you doing any COVID forecasts at the same time that you were doing this Olympics forecast? And did any of the learnings from those in terms of just how COVID was progressing affect your Olympics forecast at all?
Yeah, so the single worst question I did on in the Good Judgment Project 2.0 focus tournament was also on Japan. It was like on case numbers by the 1st of July, 2020. And I thought it would definitely reach the highest then, but it didn't. And again, this just ties back into my lack of understanding and continued lack of understanding as to how Japan has managed to avoid the worst of COVID.
One, question I had about these forecasts, and particularly this Japan forecast, is it looks like you did better on the forecasts that were harder. So the mortgage forecast, the Crowd Breyer score, which is how accurate they were, was 0.55, which Good Judgment, they have a different Breyer score system, but I think a 0.5 is the equivalent of saying a 50-50 likelihood. So they didn't really know what they were saying. When it came to the COVID deaths forecast, Community Breyer score of 0.442. Again, not much insight coming from the crowd. But when it came to the Olympic forecast, it was 0.2, which means there was some, foresight coming from the community. Do you have a sense that you do better on harder questions? Do you think maybe you viewed you're very good at COVID forecasting, which therefore means you generally are different than the community, or you're more likely to be different than the community because you are better than them, and so you can't be having their forecasts all the time. Do you think that played into anything going on here, where you were sort of less receptive to the difference between the community because you're so good at COVID forecasting?
I think this ties back into the discussion about the extent to which you should assess a question based on the base rates and the extent to which you should adjust that based on the inside view, right? So for the mortgage interest rate question, I did pretty well by pretty much only looking at the base rate. And I think if I had looked at the inside view, I would have ended up doing worse because I would have adopted the view by many others that this huge negative demand shock would cause it to fall below 3%. So in that case, a question in which I don't have a lot of background knowledge, in which I didn't look that much into the economics at play, considering the base rate works really well. For the second question on how many COVID deaths across different U.S. states, that's on the other hand is like a question in which I was following the content matter really closely, playing around with spreadsheets, where there isn't really a good base rate to look at, and in which I felt comfortable looking at the inside rate like almost exclusively and being pretty confident in it. For this question on the Olympics, I think I would have done well to not try to arrive at too much of my own inside view that went against the grain of the inside views of others who were forecasting on the same question when I didn't have a comprehensive enough understanding of the political considerations at play.
And then also looking at the graph from this forecast, it looks like the only time that the yeses outweighed the nos was like last summer, from it looks like July through September almost. Do you think that that was, in large part due to the fact that people were being swayed by, their own personal beliefs, that maybe they thought COVID would be done by the summer, and then when it wasn't gone by the summer, they felt, oh, it might just be going on, forever, and so they had sort of a pessimistic view on the question. Why do you think that last summer was like, the only real period of, where those two positions switched?
So last summer was when the community thought that there was a better chance that the Olympics would actually be canceled, right? So I think they expected COVID to continue being a big consideration and the most relevant consideration to the extent to which it would actually cause Japan and the IOC to cancel the Olympics. So that was throughout summer of 2020. And then sometime in the early fall of 2020, the community switched over to thinking that was more likely that the Olympics would actually go ahead. And I didn't update nearly as fast in that direction as the community did.
Great. So now I think we want to move along to our last sort of concluding questions. I think that was a great examination of those three forecasts, the two that you got to the right side of maybe, and the one that you got to the wrong side of maybe. And it's just really interesting to listen to your thought process on those. So to start off, I was wondering, what is the most challenging part of the forecasting process for you? And conversely, like, what is the most enjoyable? But conceivably, those two could be the same, given that the forecasting process can be quite difficult. And so some people obviously enjoy going through those challenges. So yeah, for you, what do you find the hardest and the most rewarding parts of forecasting?
I think they're both the same thing, which is learning about an area in which I don't already have at least some background knowledge. I like learning about new topics that I have no background in, but it's quite a challenge in that, like, oftentimes if I'm reading like some article on it, I don't know what a lot of the terms mean, so I have to look up those terms, and then I just fall into a rabbit hole of like reading more and more about the topic. But that's something I genuinely enjoy. It's just difficult in that it's both time intensive and oftentimes like the content matter might be quite difficult itself. Yeah.
And so maybe, you just said that, this part is pretty difficult, so you might not. But I was curious if you use any of these forecasting skills in your personal life, if it has any impact on, decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis, even if it's just sort of, you said that sometimes you can make forecasts in just a few minutes if you have a lot of knowledge about the subject. Do you make any of those quick ones?
So the clearest example, which I think I had already mentioned, of using forecasts for my own personal decision making was with respect to COVID, especially in February and March 2020, right? Apart from that, I think forecasting has influenced my career decision making to an extent, and that I've shifted from um, one area to another within the biosciences based on um, like the broad contours of predictions as to what will end up being more important in shaping the future, right? Then in terms of like my day-to-day life, I don't really employ forecasting all that much just because it's something I have a lot of control over. So instead of like saying that I think there's a 20% chance I'll actually get this uh, project done by the end of the week, I'll just like find the motivation to go ahead and do it, right? So in terms of day-to-day decision making, it doesn't really come into play, but for those other two areas, it does.
And then, sort of finally, this is a two-part question. One is, like, what sort of tools do you use when forecasting? Do you use guesstimate, for instance? Have you looked at things that they're being developed at Aut? Have you used MetaForecast that's been developed, which lets you search through forecast across multiple different platforms? So, do you use any sort of tools when you forecast? And then, more broadly, like, what are your recommendations for both new and experienced forecasters who want to get to the right side of maybe more often or earlier and with the right amount of confidence?
Yeah, so in terms of tools, so for COVID, for instance, I found myself playing around with spreadsheets a lot. Um, and I did use guesstimate sometimes. I did find it valuable for some of the questions on COVID. I have used MetaForecast or before that, just like Googling questions I'm forecasting to see if it's on any other platforms. So I have consulted like similar iterations of the same question on other platforms. Um, yeah, and then in terms of like improving forecasting skills, I think like the key by far is to practice, right? And then learning from your mistakes and reviewing your mistakes. Like I remember very distinctly, one of the worst questions I've ever that I got completely wrong in forecasting was one of the first questions I forecasted on when I first joined Good Judgment Open, and it was something about I think relating to the makeup of Taiwan's parliament, and that I consulted like some of the background reading, and there was this article by The Economist, which is probably my number one news source, that said that the KMT, which is one of the two main political parties, will probably end up gaining control of the legislature. And I just deferred to them and forecasted that they would probably gain control of the legislature for a long time, even against the community median. And I ended up being very wrong on that. So I think like one lesson is usually like the background reading gives you useful information that you should know to then make your forecasts, maybe not necessarily the source of the forecasts themselves, right?
Awesome. Andrew, any more questions for Juan?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, the only other question would be where can people find you on? Are there any exciting projects that you're working on that you want our listeners to know about? Yeah, feel free to shamelessly plug away.
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on Twitter. You can follow me at Juan_Cambeiro. I have recently come on full time for the summer as an analyst at Metaculus. So if you have any interesting ideas for like new questions to put on Metaculus, if you want me to take a look at any of the questions you want to put on Metaculus or have any cool project ideas, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm working on some projects related to biosecurity in particular. So stay tuned on that front.
Very exciting.
And yeah, it's something I just wanted to like emphasize is that like forecasting isn't just something that's fun and interesting and maybe somewhat valuable for the intelligence community specifically, which is basically what I thought when I first started forecasting. Like I just really want to make the point that it's actually something that's really important, neglected, and tractable for pretty much all fields, but especially for those in which actively shaping the future is a key objective. I mean, like for anyone like me who subscribes to long-termism, accurate forecasting, or at least knowing where to find good forecasts, is essential to guiding decision making at all levels. And it's like the logical next step after forecasting is to use forecasting to guide decision making, to like shape the future in the best possible way. So that's something I'm really excited about continuing to do work on, and that Metaculus has actually started addressing in a holistic way by partnering with nonprofits as part of its causes framework. And it's like a new exciting direction in forecasting generally that I'm really enthusiastic about.
It's so correct and so spot on and very well said, and something that Andrew and I couldn't agree with more. If you guys are listening to the show and you want to follow Juan, you'll find a link to his Twitter down in the description below. Definitely go follow him. You make some great content out there if you just want to follow. Get some good COVID information and forecasts. Couldn't recommend following him more, so make sure to check that out in the description below. I think that this was a phenomenal episode, and I certainly learned a lot, and I know our listeners will too. So thank you so much for giving us all this time and for such a wonderful podcast appearance.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun.
All right, and this was the 6th episode of The Right Side of Maybe. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.